Hello and welcome to another episode of The State of Politics. Today I am delighted to be joined by James McEnaney, who is an English lecturer. He's very prominent on Twitter. You'll probably know him. James, how you doing?
Yeah, not bad. How are you?
I'm all right. Just myself today, no Patrick, so we're going solo, but I'm sure James will be good chat. Anyway, so just to kick off, how did you basically get into, the point that you're at? Because your Twitter bio says English lecturer, journalist, and author. So how have you came this path to this very point?
So I was actually I was having to think this through for writing the bit of my book the other day. Um, so it started off when I went to be a high school teacher, which was back in 2010. I think that must have been. So I was a teacher first. I was a high school teacher, teaching English, and did that over on the Isle of Arran. So I
Right.
was sent there when you're a if anybody's looking for what they want to do, when you qualify as a teacher in Scotland, you get a year's guaranteed work basically, and you can either say you want to go say one of 5 local authorities, or you can do what's called ticking the box amongst teachers, where you can say I'll go anywhere, and if you're a high school teacher, they say that's fine and give you an extra 8 grand. So I thought that was a great idea. Get sent off to Arran, and loved it. I never wanted to be a teacher, by the way. When I was at school, when I was at uni, was adamant when I left uni I wasn't going to be a teacher, but ended up in Arran, ended up teaching, ended up loving it. But then after a few years, because of various things, personal things, the fact that Scotland is brilliant at selling the islands on Visit Scotland posters and god awful at actually looking after them. Ended up having me and my family come back to the mainland, got a job in a college, which has been good. I teach national fives and hires and stuff and some other things there. But once I came back, I sort of drifted into sort of maybe a little bit back towards this earlier ambition of journalism. A lot of it down to Angela Haggerty,
Right.
who back in 2014, 2015, was the editor of Common Space, which is one of the kind of first new media things that came out of Scotland after the referendum. She let me write a column every week. From that, I wrote a couple of things. I wrote a thing about the Bernie Sanders campaign that was in the Daily Records, because I happened to be in New York at the time a few years ago. And so it just kind of came from there. Like, because of those little breaks that I got, I then got talking to some people who knew things like how to do FOI. So like Rob Edwards at the Ferret, for example. And then I suppose I just got lucky in that as I was sort of getting to a position where I, was able to kind of write about things and investigate things, Scottish media has kind of cut away at its education experts. So, I mean, I'm trying, like, when I started this, Andy Denham was at the Herald, for example, and he was the guy on education reporting. He's now at the government. A lot of places don't have like specialist education reporters or anything like that. If they do, their job is shared with other areas as well. So I suppose I kind of had an advantage. I know a lot about the system from being trained through it and from working in it. But then I've also got maybe this additional view that I can get through the sort of investigation side, which is how I've ended up here, I suppose, as the FOI guy / the shouty guy on Twitter, and having just done the new book about Scottish schools.
How important would you say that kind of new idea of Scottish media has been? Because there has been obviously a kind of clear split politically with the kind of norms of Scottish media maybe not being as trusted by as much of the public. Do you think it's been a positive that we've developed this new type of media that, people who certainly probably share the same viewpoint as ourselves and Angela Haggerty on that question, certainly that there is a trusted source with a great band of writers that aren't going by the kind of usual lines of the Herald newspaper or somewhere like that?
Aye, I think. I mean, my preference would be development of new media along with proper, investment and development of existing media. I don't think any sort of new media stuff is a replacement fundamentally, but I think it's an excellent development in Scotland where people have clearly felt that there's been gaps in the media. There's been a sort of dearth of the kind of things that they were looking for, or thought people wanted, and they've kind of gone out and done them. Common Space was a brilliant example. The work that you guys are doing is great, kind of years down the line. Obviously, the one that I use very often is the Ferret, which is an investigative journalism platform. It's owned by its members. I do a lot of work with them. The Ferret have broken I couldn't even count now how many absolutely fantastic stories, and cover things that aren't going to get picked up other places, as well. So I think it's been really really good, in terms of broadening out the range of opinions. It's been useful for me in that I was sort of able to, I suppose, sort of drift into the kind of the media stuff, over the last few years, and that certainly started out with working on new media stuff that then got me picked up, across the more established media.
Do you find that, well, obviously you said yourself, probably there isn't as many people just that specialise in education or use that as their main goal. Do you think it's important that you have people that do specialise, that do write and talk about it, to be working within that field or have experience in it? Because obviously we see a lot of people who come through, I'm doing a journalism course myself, and will maybe go on and get a job in a newspaper or a news company, but won't have that experience. I think that's an important tool that probably has benefited you, and in terms of commentary and looking at stuff from a different perspective.
Yeah, it's certainly benefited me. A lot of the stories that I've broken over the last few years, a lot of the work that I've done, I know a lot of what I do, or maybe not even that I know. Like, anybody could probably find a lot of these things out, but there's maybe a level of understanding that has allowed me to maybe see beyond, like some of the times when I've kind of found things beyond the published government data, for example. It's been because I look at it as a sort of journalist, say, right, that's what it says, but then that other part of me looks at it and says, right, but we also do X, Y, and Z. There must be this and there must be that, So that's a big help. And there are, I think expertise is really important. A lot of the time, which is not to say that journalists and reporters as if that's some sort of problem, because obviously it isn't. But if I give you an example, like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, that the most recent round of school league tables are published, and everyone's talking about league tables that have been published by the Times, and they were showing the number of people leaving school with 5 hires, and 5 hires is a big deal was made of 5 hires because that's the gold standard. So that was what these tables were going to show, except those tables didn't show the number of kids who'd left school with 5 hires. They showed the number of kids who'd left school with at least 5 level 6 qualifications. Level 6 qualifications includes hires, but it also includes 3 or 4 other things. Some of them are worth more than hires, some of them are worth less, some of them are really, really valuable, some of them maybe arguably used by schools to bump themselves up the numbers. I know that because I know what these courses are, so you can kind of see through these sorts of things. It makes it a bit more frustrating though when you fail to really explain them to people properly. Because I feel like I should be able to explain them, but certainly for being able to see what stories could be there and figure out the way to pursue them, having a fair wealth of professional expertise and education's made a difference there, certainly, yeah.
See, on that point about 5 hires, obviously, like yourself, both been through the Scottish education system, and it was always something that popped up while I was at school. Do you think we're at a disadvantage that we have that competitive streak, and people look at that idea, as you say, the bar's set at 5 hires and that's it, and you need to achieve that goal, and if one school isn't doing that, they're classed as a bad school type thing? I think that's something that really affects our perception of education in this country.
Yeah, because the whole thing's daft, if we're honest,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I just came through the same system. I left high school in 2004, walked out of high school with 5 A's in my hires, couple of advanced hires, having not really done a huge amount of work for some of them, having got lucky in the maths exam.
I know the feeling.
That was the day of the whole kind of Celtic, European final days, So that was a bit of a kind of complicated period too. But did fine out of it. I grew up in a cul-de-sac in Eastern Bartonshire. Me leaving school with 5 A's in those hires isn't anything like the same scale of achievement as some people leaving school with 1 or 2. Because I didn't really have to go through anything to get them. The system's set up for people like me. And what you end up with is this system that obsesses over what can be easily measured. And then we try and kind of condense everything into that. So we don't much care what 5 hires people get. They're just meant to get 5 hires. And as you see, that then leads to completely unfair and unfounded comparisons between schools. It leads to the same thing between pupils who feel as if they're not doing that, they're somehow useless. But even at that, I don't even buy the idea that like your kids who are getting 5 hires are like your 5 A's in your house means they're your best students and should go on to do the best kind of things. I wasn't one of those brilliant, hard-working folk when I walked out of high school with 5 A's, but I still wanted uni quite easily, So the system's very, very crude and very, very clumsy, and we prioritise convenience in the data for us, and we can prioritise like comparability across qualifications that aren't really comparable in order to build this whole structure through which kids kind of get churned, but it doesn't tell us a great deal about what they're really capable of, how much potential they've got. 5 A's in their hires could be the peak for somebody. It could be a great achievement, but it might be them. That could be them, really academically at the proper zenith, Whereas somebody else might scrape maybe, a couple of A's, a couple of B's, and a C, but that for them might be the start, That could be somebody who goes on and gets 3 or 4 PhDs because they've grow into their education. Our current system really desperately tries to write a lot of those people off, and I think I often wonder how much we must cost the country doing that. How many people have been written off by a system that really doesn't work, and have they not gone on to do an endless number of things through which the rest of us could all have benefited, through which they might have benefited? I mean, it seems a crazy way to run a system that's so important to a country, in a way that fundamentally that kids from the richest areas of Scotland are more likely to leave school with 5 hires or level 6 qualifications than the poorest are to leave with 1. It's ludicrous, the way the system works just now. As I say, that the amount it must be costing us just strikes me as a price that must be far too high.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I was one of the lucky people that walked out of school with a good number of hires and the kind of path straight to school to university, but obviously that isn't for everybody. I might have kind of fulfilled the norms of what's been put in place, but as you say, people will grow into education and they'll take different paths, whether that be college or going and getting an internship or something, and then go on from that. So in terms of the system, we hear a lot always run up to elections and in Parliament of the attainment gap. To properly fix that issue, what would you say we need to do to properly fix that issue in terms of the system?
Stop thinking that we can fix it through the system, I suppose. So the attainment gap, if anyone's been lucky enough to avoid this whole thing, is the thing in education. It has been since 2015 when Nicola Sturgeon gave what I have said for years and maintain was a dreadfully disastrous speech for Scottish education. Who judge me on my record thing. And we've been sort of stuck in this sort of swirling vortex of closing the attainment gap ever since, and people asking, well, what do we need to do to schools to close the attainment gap, to close the gap between rich and poor? And I know people don't really like this answer. People never like this answer. But the real hard truth is there isn't actually a great deal that schools can do to, not if you want to close it, if you want to adjust it, if you want to shave a 0.5% off here or there, yeah, fine, you can do all that kind of stuff. But we've been doing that a long time. We've had 100 years of this system, generations of getting better and better at finding the equalizing power of universal education. The idea that there's some other intervention sitting out there that no one's quite thought of yet that changes the entire landscape, is just fantasy stuff. The attainment gap is simply poverty. Best way to understand the attainment gap is that's what poverty looks like when you view it through the prism of school data. That's all the attainment gap is. The attainment gap is what happens when you take the lens of school data and you look at poverty through it, and we get the attainment gap. But you're not going to do anything about that by tweaking school policies. You're not. The relationship between socioeconomics and educational outcomes is, I am afraid, and I don't like this any more than anybody else, but it's pretty ironclad. And yes, there are always individuals who break out from that system, but outliers don't change the pattern.
No.
If people are really serious, I'm not convinced they are, but if people are really serious about closing the attainment gap, then I'm afraid they're going to have to be very, very serious about a lot of really quite radical and redistributive social policies. See, when people ask me, what's the, is there a policy that would make the biggest difference to educate if there was one thing, and I always say, well, no, there's not a single policy, but if you were making me choose, maybe a policy or two that we're going to do something that I think would have a big impact, one of them would be housing. One of the first things I would go to for improving the educational outcomes of Scotland would probably be housing, because I think that's one of the things that would have the biggest impact on the lives that young people live outside of school, which have this huge impact what happens to them inside of school. So I'd be doing things that I'd be addressing the cost of living. People paying £500 and £600 rents for like 2-bedroom flats and stuff like that. But that's ludicrous and a massive impact. And wages as well. How many of the people who come from our most deprived backgrounds and are the students who show up in all the stats as the ones who are losing out all the time, how many of them have got parents who are having to work 2 or 3 jobs? Because none of their jobs actually pay them enough. How many of them have got parents who are stuck in 0 hours contracts because it's the only way they can actually get work, or at the mercy of a benefit system that's just been made more and more brutal over the last 10 years? I'd love to be able to, say that schools can flick a switch or can do something, even not something that simple, and change everything. That the Lad of Peart story, that it's all true and everything. It just isn't the case, and it's very frustrating because there are things that schools can do. It only amounts for less than 10% of all the things that have an impact on school results are things that schools can affect, right? Again, people don't like that either. But there are things that schools can do. And we know that. If you focus on improving the quality of teaching going on in classrooms by, for example, supporting teachers with less contact time, you could improve the quality of education and you could do better there. If you really relentlessly focused on attacking the cost of schooling, you could do something there too. So I know the SNP are promising it now, but things like, it said so in their manifesto, but the past manifestos have said lots of things. Things like getting rid of subject charges, music tuition charges, and stuff like that. That's the kind of area that schools can make differences, and by really improving their teaching and by really helping teachers and giving them the best working environments, then we can create the best learning environments for students. But it's that kind of level that you need to go into. That there's no throw £100 million at a project and everything's fine, and there's certainly no expecting schools to undo the consequences of multi-generational poverty, because that's absolutely not on the cards at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, so it's a case of really looking at the problem that we've got in terms of the attainment gap through a different perspective than just what governments seem to always promise and just throwing a lot of money at schools. As you say, there's only so much they can do with that in terms of actually addressing what is a bigger problem than just a school attainment. It's everything in terms of the way a kid's brought up, their house, their opportunities outside of school, what they basically get access to. Yeah,
it's experiences. It's class, right? Let's not kid ourselves on. That's what it is. It's social class, and we know that this isn't new, and I think one of the things that's really annoyed me about the attainment gap narrative over the last few years, not just the fact that it's just rhetoric, right? You can't close the attainment gap in schools, etc., right? But one of the things that's really annoyed me about it is that the more politicians have banged on and on and on about closing the attainment gap, and made that all schools focused policy, it's actually made it harder and harder to have a proper conversation about. So for all the talk that you see, even in government documents, gradually their language changed over time, from 2015 as it went on. So at first it was, completely close the attainment gap, and then it was, I think, substantively close the attainment gap, and then there are targets that were kind of there or thereabouts and stuff like that, but as all that's happened and as all the language has changed and everything, the core thing has been that it's just completely dominated everything. And it's blacked out the sun in that regard. We could have spent the last 5 years making progress on social class and education. We spent the last 5 years talking about magical policies that don't exist.
Yeah. and something that just, as you say, won't be fixed by just throwing a lot of money at something and expecting
No,
schools to come up with the goods, because
no.
it's just impossible unless you've got the right system in place at the very start of that. It just won't work because kids aren't getting those opportunities, as you rightly say, are coming from. I mean, it's still hard to look at a school league table, and the schools that tend to do the best are either private schools or schools that are in a very good area
Yeah.
that always seem to do the best.
It's
And
because
so
people stability, like if you and I go in to try and, for example, sit the same exam or go into the same class, and I've been had a nice sleep in my warm bed in my warm house and got up in the morning with my family and had a really good breakfast, a nice chat around the table, and then headed off to school in the sunshine. We're not being educated under the same circumstances. If that's me and you are waking up in the night because there's no gas in the meter for the heating, and it's freezing cold because it's Scotland, or you're having to get up an hour earlier than me in the morning to look after your siblings or look after your folks,
or going to a paper round or something like that.
We've got there's this idea somehow that Scotland in general, but the education system in particular is this kind of meritocratic heaven or something. And it's not true. And until we really get to grips with that, we just keep on letting people down. I know it's not a nice conversation. I know people don't like it, but it doesn't make it go away.
No, I think it's something that we do need to have a conversation about, and as you say, try and look at the reason why this is still happening, because we're using the wrong language and we're looking at it in the complete wrong way. We've had Lorna Slater on the podcast who spoke to us about exams, and one of the Green policies was an idea that possibly we could scrap exams going forward. What would your take on that be? Because from a personal perspective, I know exams aren't for everybody, and I actually think it would be a lot better to internally assess kids, because not everybody can do exams well in terms of the pressure and the time and everything else that comes with them.
People mean a lot of different things when they say, like reform, scrap exams and stuff like that. So I suppose it depends exactly what you're looking at. Pretty much every system still has some sort of form of final assessment. Like people talk about Finland a lot, right? Because people don't set exams every year. But end of high school, if you want to go into you sit the matriculation exam, and it's a hell of an exam as well. It's different circumstances. You do it over longer periods, you do it over a couple of different windows. You have access to things, but it depends what you mean by exam. If what you mean is the current system that we've had, forever, where at the end of fourth year, fifth year, and sixth year, teenagers get shoved into the exam hall where they all sit at their little desk and they get an hour and a half to write a critical essay and do their Scottish set text. If you mean getting rid of that, then absolutely yes, because it's absurd. It doesn't measure the things it claims to measure. It lets down far too many people. It's too easy to game is the other thing. Like lots of people who maybe on the right tend to be very suspicious of any argument about reforming the way we do exams just now, thinking that it's it's the path to everyone just being soft millennial snowflakes and blah blah blah. The current exam systems, see if you, for example, you're somebody like me, the current exam system's a bit of a scoosh to game. You memorize a bunch of things. You don't really have to do all that much work in the key areas, especially if you got a sibling or something like that, that's been through it and knows what the key bits are. And away you go, So getting rid of that kind of thing, yes, absolutely. But we still need some kind of system in place for doing some form of certification of young people for leaving secondary school, I presume. So you're still going to want some way of, I don't know, measuring what they've done so far, theoretically, sort of measuring maybe their potential, their work ethic, whatever it happens to be. But the approach to that could change quite radically. So we have there already are different approaches in Scotland. In the college where I teach, we do loads of courses that don't have final exams. They've got assessments as you go through key bits in the year. You need to meet outcomes. You need to meet requirements. If you show that you can do the things you need to be able to do, then you pass. Other types of courses run different kinds of assessment models. So you can have some courses that are completely assessed by coursework submission. Not something I'm a huge fan of, but doable. You can have ones that are completely traditional exam based, like our are just now. But you speak to people who reimagine what an exam looks like, and they talk about maybe like an English exam being, kids having a 6-hour window and access to the internet and access to all the materials and stuff like that to maybe write 2 extended essays, or do things over a period, so it is coursework, but it's kind of controlled and in class, a couple of assessment windows over the year, because the writing process actually, you know, happens over time. So you can definitely do things like that, and you don't necessarily even need to assess everything the same way either. So like right now, we assess everything using the same model, and we do that to make things easy. We do it to make things nice and comparable, so we can assign points to things, so that we can ration university access, all that kind of stuff. But you don't need to do that. You could assess maths in a different way from PE if you wanted to. You don't need to both have these big, you know, final exams because we do exams. But I think there's definitely going to be, over the next few months, there will be increasing pressure, I think, to look at an alternative system. People in this country think that what we do, because we do it, is normal. That's the approach that we have, like setting really high stakes exams in 4th year and 5th year and 6th year. Some of them in a kind of progressive model, and some of them as kind of branching. It's actually quite unusual. And if you were designing something from scratch, I don't think there are many people, if any, who would look at the system that we've got just now and say that's what they would want if they were building something from the ground up. And it can be difficult to change things that have been around for a long time. Like hires were introduced in 1888, I think it was, you know, an auspicious year. But they, you know, over that kind of period, like how much has actually changed with what we do? You know, we've changed the names of some of the exams and everything, but the principle hasn't really gone. If anything, we've maybe regressed a little bit from standard grade in terms of covering everybody. So there's a need for something quite radical. It might be something that also includes incorporating modern technology into how you assess people as well. Whether that is through, you know, just the fact that things are being done remotely, or whether it's maybe in the way that you certify things. There was this really interesting project, might still be going, a few years ago, called Open Badges. It was sort of like that, this idea of being able to build qualifications, a bit like Scout badges, I suppose. So, but when you but again, think about that as a model, like you have a thing that if you get it, your wee badge, it shows that you are, you know, competent and you have achieved a level of competence and you have done certain things. Well, this is what exams are. This is what we try and do. You know, now if you look at the documents behind, say, the Scout badges, you'll find the things that everybody had to do, blah, blah, blah. The Open Badges things reimagined that in the 21st century. They were saying you could have all sorts of learning that could be accessed online, that could be certified, with the metadata behind it would have all that information into it. You know, there are some really interesting ideas for what could be done. There are about a dozen ideas that are better than what we've got just now. The only real fear, because there's probably enough momentum just now as well, and there's widespread support, but there's still that fear that Scotland's a very conservative country, and its education system is very, very conservative. And so pushing for a big, genuinely revolutionary reform to end of school examination, it's the right thing to do, but it's not necessarily in keeping with the Scottish culture sometimes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. There's definitely enough support across the country for it. But
yeah, I was going to say, in terms of, you know, the past year in a pandemic, I would say that certainly uni level, I would say that they've learned a wee bit more. I mean, for this year we had very little exams, and it was a lot more internal essays, which I found to be a lot more beneficial, because I actually think that you write a better piece of work because you've got access to all your sources. You're not expected to go into a hot exam hall, try to remember all these different figures and then write, you know, within limited time, that you actually can produce a decent piece for the market and then go and see if you can do it. And I think what you're saying there, even about, you know, higher exams and stuff, I did music at school. Now, even though I did well, I got a good mark in my music exam, but I always thought if you'd really made a, you know, right mess of that on that day, it's such a shame because it counts for so much of your mark. Whereas you've only, you know, on that day, you know yourself, anything can go wrong, and that's what you're ultimately judged on. Which,
and the thing you've got to remember is, yes, and people tend to get that, right? This idea that, you know, it's the one day. There's not even an appeal system in Scotland anymore, by the way. A lot of people don't understand this. They think that the system's still like it was like when I was at school, where if you on the day you got a C, but you've got an A in your prelim and an A all year, your teacher could send in some stuff and say, look, give them a break, you know. Now that's what happened when I was at school. That was stopped in 2014. So it very much is now. Anything that isn't coursework, anything that is exam stuff, you have one bad day and you've had it. And the thing people, I think, really need to grasp is something that's not well understood, or at least not widely talked about. Who do you think are the kids who are more likely to be having a bad day on any given day? This is the thing, right? So your kid from one of the most deprived, neighborhoods in Scotland is more likely to be having a bad day on any one of the 365 days of the year than your kid from East Wren, right? There's no two ways about that, which means that those kids who are already disadvantaged in so many other ways anyway are also much more likely to be disadvantaged on the day of that exam, which is already a hugely stressful and difficult day, which probably magnifies the problem even further. So it goes back to this thing about writing people off. It doesn't make sense to run an education system in a way that to all the world sometimes looks like its starting point is this can only work if we chuck some folk away. Like that was what happened last year.
Mm-hmm.
The 2020 thing. That was what that was founded on what happens every year. Ultimately, a certain number of people have to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And when you kind of set out with that kind of assumption, I suppose maybe it makes it hard to really realize the damage you're doing when you then look at the system and realize it's massively disadvantaging some groups, because maybe it's easier to just sweep it away and say, oh yeah, but some people have to fail. Oh yeah, okay. Well, even if you accept that, even if you accept that some people have to fail, which isn't actually true, you can run other systems, but even if you accept some people have to fail, why do the same people always have to fail? This is the thing. Why are we okay with the same people always failing? Why can't the rich people fail for a few years just to mix it up, just to see what happens? The answer being, of course, because if the system worked in such a way, or something happened in such a way where lots of rich people were being disadvantaged in the way lots of poor people are now, then the system would be changed. That's the answer, I suppose, to that one, isn't it?
I think, as you say, that was made so blatant last August when those results came out, and we just saw a complete disaster in terms of the way it was mapped. And it all did come back to that point that you said at the very beginning of this podcast of class, based on class, which is ludicrous, because we're not going to move forward at all if we just keep putting people at the one side and going, you're going to get bumped down just because you're from a school that doesn't tend to do well, or you're from an area. Yeah.
So what happened last year was that the Scottish Government and the SQA tried to tell thousands and thousands of kids in this country that their postcode is destiny. And I still can't really get as soon as it was announced what the SQA were going to do, that they were going to use the past results of a school to moderate the results submitted by teachers, anybody who knew anything about it saw what was coming and openly said what was coming. Okay, we knew that if you use that system, then the only possible outcome of that is that you start making changes based on historic results, and those historic results are obviously tied to social class, and we know that. So you're going to start moderating the grades of kids based on the social class of the people who came before them. It was always indefensible. It was a ludicrous thing to do. But basically, what it came down to, and that willingness to tell people, well, we're terribly sorry, a bunch of you failed, but you are from a poor area, so what did you expect? Which is basically what was going on there. The idea was that the system the word they kept using was credible. It was really offensive. The system has to be kept credible. And how do we keep it credible? By failing a bunch of kids. Which kids? Well, the poor kids, obviously, because that's the way it has to go. Because there's no alternative. We just have to do that. This. If we don't do this, then everything will fall apart. Everything will go wrong, and so you ended up in a situation where, it came out in bits as well. At first, it looked really bad because we had the social deprivation breakdowns for the students, but they are based on a student's postcode. So they were showing things like, I think off the top of my head, was it were hires twice as likely to be downgraded for the people in the poorest postcodes as opposed to the richest postcodes. But what I found out a couple of months later, did a bit of work on it with Barry Black, a researcher at Glasgow Uni. We got all the schools data, and we got the number of changes like downgrades and changes from particularly passes to fails. And we combined that with data on free school meals for each school. Because that was the thing. The SQA didn't set out and say, you live in a poor postcode, so therefore it's your grade that's going down. The SQA came out and the government approved the process of coming out and looking at a school, an entire school community, and saying, you've submitted more Bs than we think you're entitled to from the past. So we're going to start, or A's or C's or whatever, so we're shoving all the grades down. It happened at a school level. And when you looked at it on a school level, what you saw was basically you have like private schools where up to 10% were in free school meals, 20%, 30%, 40%, and you just get this completely straight line. And free school meals is a better measure of poverty in a lot of ways. So what you ended up with was just this clearly direct relationship between poverty and the chances of having your grades pulled down, particularly the chances of having them move from a pass to a fail, which is, it's one thing, going from like a B to a C. Nothing, it should never have happened. None of it should have happened.
Yeah.
But how did anybody who's supposed to be intelligent enough to be running these systems on 100 odd grand a year, etc., right? How did any of them not look at that and say, hold on a second, we're going to take a bunch of kids whose teachers said they passed, and basically because of the postcode of their school, they're just going to have to fail. Is that how this is working? How it's the fact that was allowed to get to the stage where we had to have the fight over it, where John Swinney had to apologise, just shows you that the people running Scottish education represent all the wrong people. If the wrong kind of people are in the rooms making decisions, then they will be representing the interests of the wrong kind of people, and that's a fairly big part about what happened. Because again, if that system had been put together and they had done a wee dry run and they'd got their algorithm and everything, and it had become clear that loads and loads and loads of kids in mostly rich areas were going to have a whole bunch of their grades pulled down, I absolutely guarantee you that would have been scrapped before it got anywhere near results being sent out. Because you could have done it that way. All that happened was basically the overall system said there needs to be a certain level of balance. If that system had set out to balance it by saying, right, well, you live in one of the richest postcodes, give us one of your A's back. You know what would have happened? So again, there was a fair bit of incompetence in there. There was a fair bit of conservatism. We must protect the system at all costs, and that kind of trying to protect the system and protect the jobs that come with it and all that. A fair bit of that as well, because if we can do it without exams, then why do we need X, Y, and Z? All fine. But underneath it all was class. Underneath it all was a bunch of working class kids and a bunch of poor kids who didn't matter as much. And so when it became clear that the way they were going to try and rescue the system was going to do it at the expense of those kids, the decision was made that that was a price worth paying. And fortunately, a lot of those kids didn't allow it. Fortunately, there were protests. Fortunately, there were enough voices in Parliament to try and do something about it. And fortunately, in the end, John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon U-turned. And John Swinney gave the apology and everything like that. But as I say, the fact that they even got to that stage, you really, I mean, not to oversell this or anything, right? But you really need to ask some real deep and searching questions about the kind of people that are running things, that folk in charge could have looked at that system and said, yeah, this is fine, let's go with it.
Yeah, and the fact that, there was hardly anybody that lost their job or anything over that.
Nobody loses jobs. 100 odd grand a year, you don't lose your job for completely failing to do it. No.
In terms of people in the SQA and above that it was just a kind of, okay, let's move on, and that's it. And I think as well, James, it sent out a really bad message to Scotland's teachers, in the sense of, we don't trust you as long as we can create this picture, which is a false picture, as you've rightly said, of how the system should work. And that system really, disadvantaging people from working class areas and people from the lowest rates of poverty, just so we can keep with the status quo. It looks all right, and we'll just bang it off, and that'll be it. Nobody will say anything. Obviously, this year we've still been living under lockdown conditions. Kids obviously went back to school last August, but then turn of the year, back into lockdown. Multiple kids will have been self-isolating for college, universities, been working from home constantly. Kids, especially from poorer backgrounds, probably not had access to as much Wi-Fi sources, and obviously it's been something that they're wanting to roll out a wee bit more. But can you see a repeat of last year on the cards once again?
This year's worse. Like, at least last year in the end, like, the really bad thing got undone because there was a big bad decision in the middle of everything, you know, and that could be sort of ripped out again. But if you think about it, like last year, schools closed in March, right? What do you usually have between March and the exams being sat? You know, study leave, lots and lots of recapping,
Revising,
there's loads of revising, loads and loads of practice papers and all that kind of stuff in schools. You know, another sign of how bad our system is. Easter holidays, all that kind of stuff. Kids didn't really lose, not the ones sitting exams, but didn't really lose all that much in terms of direct teaching time towards their courses last year.
Mm-hmm.
And then teachers were asked to give a grade, and crucially, they were told last year, I remember filling in the estimates, we were told, you know, that we could infer the students' performance, by which they meant that, like, if you were sitting and all you had in your hand was, say, a prelim that showed they were getting a C, but you had worked with them all year and you knew they were better than that, and you know that every year, you know, your kids go from this kind of level at the prelim and tend to go up by 10% and all that kind of stuff. You could back it up as a professional. That was fine, given the grade they actually deserved. So that wasn't a particular problem, you know. And then it became a problem when the SQA got involved, made the system too complicated, and then decided to try and moderate things, and that was a disaster. Then this year comes along. And first of all, schools are allowed to start the year in August 2020 without knowing how they're going to end them in terms of final courses. Mm-hmm. That was unforgivable. That's ludicrous. Again, another one of these things where you look and go, how on earth are these people running this thinking this is okay? There was no way a normal exam timetable could possibly have been guaranteed. So that being the case, the 2021 exams should actually have been cancelled before the summer in 2020. Had that happened, we could have run the school year from August to December, knowing there were not going to be exams and gradually gathering evidence. There could be a nice framework in place for that, light touch, guiding, you know, this is roughly what we'd be looking for you to use, but still fundamentally, A, trusting teachers, and B, letting them infer judgment where necessary, where they know better than a spreadsheet in the SQA's offices somewhere. But instead, what we got was the SQA and the government insisting that exams were going to go ahead, cancelling National 5s, I think, in October, and then finally getting the guts to do the same for higher and advanced higher in December. Using the model that had been designed in October to do National 5 awards by gathering up assessment material and stuff like that, that was designed for the rest of the year being a wee bit disrupted. Then we got to a lockdown, which destroyed that original plan, but the SQA are not capable of actually doing plans or coming up with useful working plans. So they basically just froze and stuck to the lines, you know. No inferred attainment, demonstrated attainment only, must have the paperwork. And so as a result of that kind of mistake, kids across the country came back for the Easter holiday and have been ground through what in some cases have been the most appalling assessment schedules I've ever seen. Some of them that people have sent me, I've looked at, and I know fine well that as a 34-year-old professional, there is absolutely no way I could perform anything like my best with the frequency of assessments that they were facing. Because what some schools did was they used SQA guidance as best they could, and SQA had said that we'll send out these exam papers that you can use if you want to. Hint, hint. But some schools broke them up to try and make it more manageable. So instead of having like a 2.5-hour exam one day, that big thing, you know, they might have like 45-minute papers across a few weeks, and you can see what the rationale is there. I think probably in the end, for some people, certainly it might have just made it worse, stretching out more, you know. But the schools were put in an impossible position. So we're now in a situation where kids have been through that. They went through the first half of the year, constant disruption, been told exams will happen. Then they were getting told exams aren't going to happen. We'll be using all your previous stuff. Then they were getting told, actually, we can't do that. We need to do exams. We've got to be exam conditions. You need to come in and do all of these, you know, all these mad assessments, which are basically just exams, but we can't call them exams. Then all the stuff appears online, which it was always going to, because everyone's sitting tests at different times. And what the hell did anybody expect to happen? So everything appeared on TikTok and then appeared on Discord. So we've had teachers put through the mill all year, never really having any certainty about, even now actually, but never really having any certainty through the year about what was going on, working way beyond capacity to try and make all of this stuff work. We've had kids put through a very similar kind of process, huge disruption, never really being clear about what was coming, all the anxiety that comes from that. We've had the lockdown, which created huge problems with gathering evidence, with remote teaching. In some cases, course not being fully completed, other courses managed into and things like that. And all of that's then come together with the fact that there have been people who've sat exam papers that they have seen when other people sat them 2 weeks earlier and didn't see them. So the last year's system was an emergency system that wasn't ideal, but was pretty solid and pretty credible until the government tried and the SQA tried to wade in. And that wading in went so badly, they got booted back out again. The system got put back to teacher judgment, and actually it was okay. It was relatively sound and it was reliable. This year, we don't have that. These results aren't reliable. Again, if I sit an exam and you sit an exam, and both of our teachers use the full SQA paper, but you sit it on the 1st of May, and I sit it on the 1st of June, and I sit it after watching the TikTok video that one of your pals made, tell me what the questions were. That's not fair and reliable. Things are happening, schools are sort of been put under pressure just now to be adjusting their grade boundaries as well. So if their kids have done too well in the test that they run, then they're being encouraged to, maybe you want to look at the grade boundaries, which is all a very, as I say, sort of wink way of saying, you don't want the results being out with the, out with the trends or anything like that. That's the algorithm again. That's last year. That's the system that last year said that, and we're making the same mistake again in some ways, but the SQA are sort of having it implemented by stealth. I think, rather than openly doing it like they did last year, it's like this year they're just trying to be sneaky about it and get it done kind of at source. So like if schools all start changing their grade boundaries to try and have like the same number of A's, B's and C's as in other years except 2020, how is that any different from what happened last year? When the estimates were put in, the computer said no, and we were told actually that the results need to be in line with all these previous years. That's not how you start, any sort of process for reform, and it's not a way that you start giving out grades to kids who've been through all of this through the last 18 months now. So while the first system was horrendous and people should have been sacked and people should have resigned, and anybody who didn't see it coming isn't clever enough to have been in charge, it was a panicked and very, very flawed response to an emergency situation, which did show people shouldn't be in those jobs, but panicked emergency response. This is worse because there was plenty of time to plan for this. Because if the right people had been in charge, they could have planned for this. Because if people hadn't been too scared of making what are apparently difficult decisions about, cancelling exams for a year and stuff like that, then we wouldn't have had to have been in this position. And fundamentally, if we had learned the lesson of last year, which is that in these circumstances, you absolutely need to put young people first, no matter what. The system can't come first. It's just a system. It doesn't actually matter. What matters is people. What matters is kids across the country and their lives. And somehow, even after everything that happened last year, the biggest education scandal of the devolution era, John Swinney having to give an apology in Parliament, after all of that, the people in charge have still managed not to learn what was and should have been the most fundamental lesson. As I say, put the kids first. Always put the kids first.
They've just dressed the system up as something that is very much so the same as the response last year, but as you say, put it at source to the teachers this time so they don't look as bad, and when the results eventually do come out, it's not the SQA fault, it's going to be their fault, and they can point the finger at somebody else.
That's a big part of it. People have been saying this for weeks now. The SQA have basically been trying to set this up so that they can say that this all fell apart because of teachers. Our system was fine, but if it hadn't been for teachers not doing this or doing that, if it hadn't been for young people using social media, then everything would have been okay. Do you hear yourselves? Like if it hadn't been for young people in the 21st century using social media to discuss that, like, honestly, you find yourself sometimes kind of looking at all this and thinking, like, do the people running things actually listen to themselves when they speak, or do they just sort of drift in and out as it suits them? It very much feels like the latter a lot of the time. And this year, yeah, as you say, so we've ended up, sort of by stealth. But if schools are getting put under huge pressure that they are not allowed to infer judgments on students, it must be demonstrated, i.e., you must have the paperwork. If that stands, people are still trying to fight this just even now. And if Shirley Ann Somerville wants to do something really quick, relatively easy and big in her new job, that's the first thing I'd have been doing if I had been her. But without it, as I say, we've just ended up back where we were. A system that's so concerned about why don't the grades line up with previous years, and let's make the grades line up with previous years. No real consideration of the fact that what if in all those previous years, what if it's up until 2019, what if every single year we were just suppressing grades? And if we were suppressing grades every year up to 2019, let's go back to that original question. Whose grades do we think were being suppressed? Were we suppressing the grades of kids at Fettes College or St Ninians in East Wren? I very much doubt it. So yeah, this all about putting the system first, protecting the status quo. Don't rock the boat too much. I've been this way. This is Scotland. We don't change things, etc., etc. And we're sitting another year watching kids get ground through that as if that's meant to be okay. It shouldn't be okay.
Yeah, and it just became a type of normal situation. It's almost as if they're still using the plan from the introduction exams in 1888 with language like that about social media. And then even just, I mean, I think if you look at it from a social perspective, just now, I live in Glasgow, but we're just getting moved down on Friday from level 3 to level 2, meaning people will have, thanks very much. Just having that wee bit more freedom that, kids at 15, 16 might be able to go and visit their pals and whatnot and just get out a wee bit more, because everybody's been suffering. And I think that needs to be something that they need to really consider, because, kids have been stuck indoors for all this time like everybody else. And when they're getting that bit of freedom back, they're not going to be able to do it because they're got their heads down in a book in school at weekends or whatever and not being able to enjoy that. Hopefully, I think we probably are heading for the same disaster to come in August, but it would have been really interesting, I think, to see the opportunities that had the system in place last year worked before the intervention by the SQA, of giving kids that better opportunity and letting their teachers decide where that would have taken them. Because I think that would have given a lot more kids a greater opportunity in terms of college and uni applications.
So here's one of the things about that, right? Actually, so last year the pass rates went up. Uni entries and college entries went up, actually, in the middle of a pandemic. Positive destination data showed employment went down, but university and college access went up. So something happened last year that must have went okay, But here's the thing. So let's say some people looked at particularly the increase in the pass rates, but also the increase in the different grades, and said that was an example of grade inflation. But here's the thing. Imagine you've got a class of students, right? And 10 of them are borderline. They've spent the entire year, maybe pass, maybe not, right, for the exam. But the thing is, they've met all the requirements. They've handed in the bits of work. They've passed the class test and everything. They've never been amazing. It's never been, right, they're an absolute stick on A or anything like that. Always a bit iffy, but always there or thereabouts, and always meeting the standard. But if you're a teacher, you know that with that 10, say that those 10, right, before they go into an exam, half of them are going to fail. Doesn't matter that through the year they've met all the requirements and they've passed tests and everything like that, because it's just the way the game goes, the way the exam works. Half of them are going to fail, and every year you send in your students, including your borderline kids, knowing that half of them will fail, just hoping for a good day, a good paper, whatever. But see, with an exam, there is no who's going to fail because some people have to fail. So all of a sudden, see those 10 students that you had who in a normal year would be 50% would pass and 50% would fail. Last year they all passed. And last year it was right that they all passed, because these were people who had met the standard for the course as it went through the year. And on top of that, in the middle of a pandemic, you err on the side of, human beings and kids, But that was why the pass rate went up. when you were looking at your borderline cases, if you can absolutely guarantee which kids are the ones who are statistically supposed to be failing, then you can't ethically or professionally fail any of them. So the pass rate goes up. But that increased pass rate is actually just a reflection of the number of people who have genuinely met the standard for the course. It's not grade inflation, it's grade correction. And the same thing probably happens at different stages. It becomes less of an issue there. But, if you're looking at a borderline case, you're going, some of the work this year has been an A, or some of it's been a bit, I don't really know. Especially last year, of course you err on the side of the student. But you probably always should, if it's about have they met the requirements for this, and this, So a system like we had last year did actually manage to give a few more opportunities to some people. A few more people did go to uni and college because of last year. It didn't do anything about the gap between rich and poor. So as the pass rate went up amongst, say, the poorest kids, it also went up amongst everybody else. I can't remember off the top of my head if there were any individual bits of the gaps from the data last year that did close. A couple of them, maybe a wee bit, but overall, it didn't really make any difference to it. The system prevails in that sort of regard. But fundamentally, even a shift from what we call a norm-based system just now, where some people have to fail and the line will be moved each year to make sure that happens, and the moving of the line is more likely to push poor kids below it. I switched to a competency-based system that says, you need to have demonstrated your ability to do X, Y, Z through the course of the year, or demonstrate your knowledge of this, and this through the course of the year. Is one of the ways, for example, in which if you wanted to, you could reform the certification system, learning some of the lessons that we've learned this year and last year, and build something that might be a bit more reflective of people's genuine ability, at which point you've then got more people, the ones who really, a lot of the time are going to be the ones who don't quite have like the passing grades in a couple of subjects. But if your pass rates have gone up because people have met, if we stop saying we're going to fail those people this year just because we haven't failed enough, and said, well, actually, you've met the requirements, so that's fine. If we did that, then yeah, we could get more opportunities that way as well. We could also stop just rationing things like university access, if we really felt like that too. But that's probably a whole extra layer of stuff we've got to get through for that one.
I think it's probably going to be a case of one step at a time with them. But in terms of, there could be a lot more of a positive spin put on the way in which we work to give people opportunities instead of just, trying to go with the status quo and saying, no, you're from a poor background, you can't get any. That's not what you expect of you. Just before we finish up, you're writing a new book just now. Could you give us a wee bit of a background about that and how it's going?
It's drafting in today is how it's going. Finally, so I was away up at Knapdale for the weekend there, finishing that. So it's a book about Scottish schools, funnily enough. Doesn't really exist. There isn't a book out there that's for non-experts, people who are not teachers and academics and stuff like that. So I have written, I suppose, a book that's, I suppose, try to tell people the truth. Trying to cut through all the endless shouting and rhetoric around curriculum for excellence and whether it's failed. Trying to see, has the attainment gap really closed? Does the data that we collect actually do the job that it's supposed to do? As well as maybe highlighting some of the good things about the system, and also looking at some of the things that we could change as we come out of the pandemic period. So the plan is for that to be available around about the start of the school year. So hopefully sometime in August, maybe early September. I still have to finish a title, but the working title has been, the thing I've been using on social media and stuff, has been, quite simply the truth about Scotland schools, because that is the idea. And as I say, very much try to write something that isn't for the experts in academics, but that the experts in academics that I know and who helped with bits of it aren't going to slate me for, like not so incredibly detailed that, a normal person looks at it and thinks this is just this is unbearable. Who could be bothered with all this? But not so lacking in detail that I've got, Regis professors and stuff getting on at me about my poor presentation of the issues. A tricky balancing act at points, but hopefully if it can help shine a bit of light on these sort of controversial parts of the system, and maybe spark a bit of conversation about what we should be doing next. As we kind of come out of all, as we hopefully now come out of all of this, then that'll feel like a job well done, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully, you can send a couple of signed copies to St Andrew's House and maybe the SQA headquarters. It might give them a wee bit of direction in their job that they might need.
Might just go straight in the shredder if I sent to the SQA, to be honest. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. It might be good for a laugh.
It might be good. James, thanks very much for joining us on The State of Politics.
No worries. Thanks very much.